My name is Garrett Sumter, and along with Audrey Elidago, Danielle Feliciano, and Chixing Zhang, who are all students at California State University Long Beach, we will be presenting an epidemiological review of the 2014 Ebola outbreak that occurred in rural populations of West Africa. The first documented cases of Ebola were reported in 1976, and while several dozen outbreaks have occurred since then, with varying degrees of mortality, almost all of them originated in Western Africa. The main outbreak that we'll be looking at began in 2014 and lasted for a period of 3 years, sweeping through large portions of Western Africa, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. This epidemic was the largest Ebola outbreak in history and was quickly sensationalized by media around the world. According to the CDC, there were a total of 28,652 suspected cases in this outbreak, resulting in an unthinkable 11,325 deaths. In other words, 2 out of 5 people who got Ebola in this outbreak died, a mortality rate of 40%. And while this mortality rate is not uncommonly high for the Ebola virus, the sheer number of people infected by Ebola in this outbreak produced such a deadly outcome. As a result of this outbreak, the economy in these Western African countries took a major hit, losing an estimated $2.2 billion in gross domestic profit in the year 2015 alone. In response, the CDC estimates that $3.6 billion were donated for Ebola aid during that same year, although most of this money did not go directly to those countries most affected. Here we have a table representing the reported cases of Ebola in the 2014 to 2016 outbreak over time. Each colored line on this graph represents the 3 countries who were most affected by this outbreak: Guinea in blue, Liberia in red, and Sierra Leone in green. Although several other countries did experience Ebola cases during this outbreak, these 3 countries represented 28,616 of the reported 28,652 cases. As you can see at the beginning of this graph, in the lower left-hand corner, the first reported case of Ebola for this outbreak occurred in March of 2014 in Guinea. And then several months later, Sierra Leone and Liberia both experienced their first cases. And then if you look at the top of the graph, you can clearly see that Sierra Leone experienced the highest amount of Ebola cases during this outbreak. Another interesting thing depicted in this graph is the time at which each country experienced a plateau in no new cases, which varied slightly between the countries, ending with Sierra Leone towards the end of 2015. This map illustrates the 2014 Ebola outbreak in kind of a different way of looking at it. As we discussed on the previous slide, Sierra Leone experienced the highest number of cases, with surrounding Guinea and Liberia also being hit hard by this outbreak.
The agent of disease for Ebola is the Ebola virus. It is a lipid-enveloped, negatively stranded RNA virus that belongs to the viral family Filoviridae. It has a thread-like appearance with a length of 1 micrometer and a diameter of 96 to 98 nanometers. It can take on multiple shapes, such as long branched filaments and short filaments shaped like the number 6, the letter U, or a circle. Here we have the CDC's electron microscopic image of the Ebola virus virion. We can see that it does have the characteristic thread-like appearance. Here we have an illustration of the Ebola virus. It has an RNA genome which is contained within nucleoproteins. There is a viral polymerase complex which consists of polymerase L and the protein VP35. There is a matrix protein VP40 which is responsible for morphogenesis and budding. This allows the virus particles to multiply. There are also glycoproteins all along the virus's surface. There are 5 subtypes that cause the Ebola virus: Zaire, Sudan, Thai forest, Bundibugyo, and Reston. Zaire Ebola virus, or ZBOV, is responsible for the 2014 West Africa Ebola outbreak. It is also the subtype that has caused the majority of human deaths from Ebola. After the virus enters the body, dendritic cells and macrophages become hosts for viral replication, allowing for the virus to spread. As a result, there is necrosis in the liver, kidneys, lymphoid tissues, and other organs. Vascular damage also occurs, upsetting the body's ability to maintain homeostasis. The incubation period is 2 to 21 days. Symptoms worsen if the disease persists. There are 4 phases of symptoms. The first phase is influenza-like syndrome, which consists of fever, headache, sore throat, and fatigue. If the patient does not respond to antibiotics, he or she will experience the acute phase. This second phase consists of diarrhea and vomiting in addition to the previous symptoms. The third phase is pseudo-remission, in which people may show signs of improvement. If they still do not improve, they will experience the last phase, aggravation. This is when the infected has spots and rashes on the skin, respiratory disorders, and cardiovascular distress. Because Ebola has symptoms similar to other diseases, the disease must be diagnosed correctly and immediately for proper treatment and disease control. Here are some of the CDC's illustrations of a few of the symptoms. People will at first experience fever, and then if their conditions worsen, they may start seeing rashes on their skin. The Ebola virus is a zoonotic disease. This is a term for a disease that can spread from animals to humans. The virus is transmitted to humans via infected bats and primates. People who handle wild animals such as hunters and those who enter caves containing bats are at risk of contracting the virus from the disease's primary reservoirs. Besides being exposed to infected bats or primates, humans can also be infected if they have direct contact with bodily fluids such as semen, blood, and feces from another infected person, and have contact with objects contaminated with infected bodily fluids. Ebola is spread when these fluids breach mucous membranes or enter through any open wounds. Precautionary measures must be taken to prevent the rapid spread of this disease. Because the disease's first appearance in 1976 was due to the use of unsterilized needles, people must be careful with objects that may be contaminated with infected bodily fluids. Healthcare workers and others must properly handle and dispose possibly contaminated objects. Staying aware of their own health status and being attentive to their surroundings will help control the spread of the disease. Here is an infographic from the CDC that describes Ebola virus ecology and transmission. It first starts out with animal-to-animal transmission. Bats are the reservoir hosts for the virus and spread the virus to primates and others. Then a human gets infected when he or she encounters these infected animals through hunting or other ways of exposure. Humans spread the disease among themselves through contact with bodily fluids from infected people. Those who do recover from the disease are able to return to their community with the addition of a few symptoms, such as fatigue.
Even Ebola virus become a huge threat to us. We still don't have effective treatment for this virus. The best thing we can do to control the outbreak is prevention. The purpose of primary prevention is to prevent healthy people from becoming infected. For Ebola virus, the patient should be isolated. People should have a good hygiene habit. Avoid contaminated people, animals, or objects. There are good sample and waste management. Once the patient is exposed to the virus, the prevention gets into the secondary prevention. In this step, it is important to make the quick and right diagnosis. And because there's a latency between the symptoms and the virus infection, people who have contacted the infection source should be isolated and monitored for a period of time. Tertiary prevention aims to improve the patient's quality of life by softening the negative impacts of the disease. For the Ebola infected patient, even nearly 15% patients will die. It is important to improve their life quality. For example, pain treatment.
Host factors. So far, there has been no conclusive evidence to prove that there are significant differences between males and females in terms of their vulnerability. So far, they have shown to have similar incubation periods, time between symptoms and hospitalization, and time between hospitalization and death. The only significant difference that has been found is that women are less likely to die than men are. It's unclear why this is, though it's suspected that social factors may play a part in that. Age also influences the likelihood of catching Ebola. The likelihood of catching it increases with age, as children are found to be less likely than adults to catch the virus. This table represents the number of recorded cases of Ebola in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, which were the 3 most infected nations. It's sorted out between male patients and female patients. As stated earlier, most of this is the same between males and females, until you get to the bottom where it says case fatality rate. In all cases, males have a higher fatality rate than women do throughout the 3 nations. The following graphs represent the incidences of Ebola by age group among the 3 most infected nations. The top graph represents all confirmed and probable cases, graph B is all confirmed cases, and graph C is all cases excluding that of health workers. In all of these cases, the incidences rise as age goes up. Environmental variables. Environmental variables can affect a person's vulnerability to Ebola. For geography, some communities where the virus was strongest were built in areas where bats were common. Bats, of course, are known to carry the disease. Living in these communities increased exposure to these bats as well as to the Ebola virus. The urbanization of communities. Underdeveloped communities are those that are most susceptible to the disease. They receive few of the country's monetary resources and have poor health resources and health education. As a result of poor resources and education, many citizens turn to faith healers rather than to professionals when it comes to medical help. Politics. Political corruption is common in the area. Political corruption leads to large health inequalities, which creates more underdeveloped regions. As stated earlier, these regions have poor monetary and health resources. Occupation. Health workers are most likely to catch Ebola. They have higher exposure rates than the general public. Because of the poor health education and resources in this area, it also means that the health workers are not well equipped or well trained enough to deal with the virus. If you look at the exposure rates at the peak of the Ebola outbreak, health workers take up a significant portion of those who have caught the virus. Temporal variation. It is suspected that seasonal trends have something to do with the temporal variation of the Ebola virus. It is suggested that incidences increase when areas have higher humidity and lower temperature. This is because the number of bats carrying the disease increase in this season due to their fighting and mating practices. Typically, this occurs between the rainy and dry seasons, when the seasons are changing. This corresponds with what we know of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. This region's rainy season is typically between May and October, and the dry season between December and February. The Ebola virus peaked around October and November, right when the seasons were changing, and slowly declined after that.
There are still some questions about the Ebola virus we are not very clear. One question is how the Ebola virus transmits between people. We know that virus can be transmitted by body fluid with contact, but can the virus be transmitted by air? The animal experiments show that the virus can be transmitted by air, but in the human, most cases are transmitted by contact, and we are not sure if there are cases which are transmitted by air. The second question is, we still don't have lots of vaccines for the Ebola virus. Right now, some vaccines have got into the clinical trials, but it still don't know if they are effective in the patients. The third question is about the medicine for Ebola virus. Some medicines are developed, but they are still in experimental stage, and we don't know their effect in human yet. So for the next step, the research should make clear how the Ebola virus is transmitted. Can it be transmitted by air from person to person? Can it be transmitted by mosquitoes? This is important for us to make policy to prevent the virus infection. And the vaccine is a very powerful weapon for us to fight a virus. The researchers should develop the effective vaccine and further to verify its effect in patients. Does it work in all the people or just in healthy people? Does it work in all the populations or just some populations? And there are some questions for the medicine of Ebola virus infections.
As you'll hear from the other presenters in the group, Ebola remains a dangerous disease for a number of reasons. The Ebola virus has a high pathogenicity, or the ability to cause a disease, as well as a high virulence, meaning once infected, it can go on to cause a great deal of damage and death. And despite the increased amount of money that has gone to Ebola research over the past several years, there remains no approved treatment or cure. Because of these facts, combined with the potential to weaponize Ebola in a bioterrorism attack, few diseases have the capacity to cause such widespread damage. As a group, we feel it's crucial that this disease receive the $100 million in funding, which may help prevent another large-scale Ebola outbreak, saving thousands of lives.